Hi everyone, welcome to week 2. I want to begin this introduction video by thanking you for some really generous engagement, I think, in the material for the first week, which I know for some of you especially was demanding. Obviously, we're testing many of our assumptions about who Jesus is in the way that we are returning to Old Testament expectations for Israel's and the world's future. And I think as some of our assumptions are tested, we can be tempted to sort of jump to the conclusion that between these visions of the Old Testament and what we're seeing of Jesus, or what we know of Jesus, there is just an obvious disconnect. And while I think that it is true that the relationship between the hope of Messiah in the Old Testament as well as in the intertestamental period and the life of Jesus, that relationship is not a straightforward one or a simple one, I hope that you'll leave some room in your mind to discover ways in which Jesus answers the hopes that we have been looking at in the prophets in ways that perhaps you hadn't imagined possible or conceived as within kind of the realm of what would fit those words of hope, those visions for the future. As I remarked in some of the forums, the tendency that many of us might have to jump to the conclusion that these are visions of world peace, the sudden conclusion of all things evil, as ready to hand as those interpretations of the prophets might be, they really don't answer to the diversity of prophetic expectation either. And it turns out that some of our kind of intuitive ways of imagining liberation, for example, simply expelling the Romans from the land of Israel, which they're oppressing along with the other lands that they have conquered in their empire, it turns out that that kind of expulsion really wouldn't address the underlying hostility, say, that divides Israel from other peoples, that feeds the appetite for dominance. And so, while I don't want to underestimate the serious political implications of who Jesus is according to Old Testament expectation, nor do I want us to settle for an overly sort of simplistic politics where the absence of Romans in the land means messianic peace. So many Christians, of course, have opted for such a spiritualized understanding of Jesus that he's no political good whatsoever. And that, I think, quite clearly does not answer Old Testament messianic hopes, but nor would an adequate answer be merely the expulsion of Rome, for example, or enough food for all the people of Israel for 1 year, without addressing the underlying economic patterns by which some people are left hungry and impoverished while others are not. So just a invitation here to you to give some space and time to your vision of Jesus, perhaps for it to be able to grow through our study of the Gospel of Mark more closely this week 2, as well as the rest of the New Testament, and to maybe watch out for those easy distinctions of, say, Jesus delivers spiritual goods and not political or economic ones. I hope that you've seen that those kinds of distinctions don't hold up very well under scrutiny if we uh, take the language of the Bible on its own terms, which doesn't really observe any kind of thoroughgoing distinction of that kind. The forgiveness of sins, which many of us have grown accustomed to thinking of as primarily a spiritual phenomenon, we see in the prophets is clearly a bodily, political reality that has deep heart implications as well. And we see that beginning to bud in just the glimpses of Jesus that we've given in the course, where the forgiveness of sins clearly has bodily implications, healing, and not just the healing of one person, but a paralyzed person's condition affects a whole web of people around him or her. And so just keep your minds open. We certainly want to not be easy on ourselves in terms of our understanding of who Jesus is, but we also want to, you might say, give the New Testament a chance. And that's partly what this class is about. So hope that will be of some guidance to you for this week. Thank you again for engaging some of this challenging material with such energy, I think, and thoughtfulness in your responses last week. I was really moved by them and sense that we're already getting a good conversation going. Quick word about where we're headed this week. We're going to be focusing on two matters primarily, and you'll see them both come up in Response Forum 1 and then dealing with them in a more developed way in the work for Response Forum 2. The first matter is the question of the Jewishness of Jesus. And I say it that way purposefully, the question, because what it means for Jesus to be a Jew is a complex matter. I don't want to trade in any sort of questions about whether or not Jesus was Jewish. Clearly he was, but what it meant to be Jewish in Jesus' day and in his time is itself a difficult question to answer that has all kinds of moving parts to it. And so we're going to wrestle with that, especially because of how that relates to our understanding of who Jesus is and how we relate to Jesus as Christian people. So we'll be reading a variety of sources on that and sort of probe that question a little bit deeper and maybe give us some new angles on the testimony of the Gospels, which all present Jesus in a deeply Jewish milieu, trying to get at that testimony with a little bit more insight. The main gospel that we're going to focus on for this week is that of Mark. We read Matthew for last week. Some of you also read all of Mark. We all read at least the first chapter of Mark. We're going to see a little bit of the Gospel of Luke this week as well. We'll all be reading the whole Gospel together, and there's a little bit of material on it, but the focus is really going to be on the Gospel of Mark. And besides this question of who Jesus is as a Jew, the second matter that we're going to really try to bring some focus to in this week 2 is how to take seriously the narrative form of the presentation of Jesus in the New Testament, particularly in the case of the second gospel, the gospel according to Mark. We have often read the Gospels in a very piecemeal way, as if they were just a kind of hodgepodge of fragments or cool stories about Jesus, when in fact, I think a more patient consideration of them shows them to be careful, artfully crafted presentations of the whole of who Jesus is in a succinct way that you could sit and listen to it be performed in an hour or an hour and a half. They're highly selective. but they are crafted works of art with all kinds of subtlety to them. The closest analog to which I think we might be able to see in the art form of film in our day. And so you're going to be reading some critical engagement with Mark as narrative, trying to help you develop some sort of at least beginner skills with how to track with the flow and development of a narrative and to read the Gospels in virtue of the narrative form that they are, and thus to understand what they tell us about Jesus, how they convey Jesus to us as a function of that narrative presentation. In response forum 2, you're going to be reacting to a presentation by me, a kind of summary presentation of the narrative of Mark from where we left off last week all the way to Jesus' last week. We'll stop short of the scenes that lead to his betrayal after the Last Supper and his trials and whatnot. So we'll finish with Mark 13, his closing discourse in the second gospel. But you'll see that what I'm trying to do in that presentation is to give you a kind of rough but panoramic view, perhaps, of how narrative works in the New Testament, how you have to read the progression of the story as a sequence of scenes, somewhat like what you have in a movie where you can't make sense of subsequent scenes very well if you don't take into account the preceding scenes, especially the ones that have led directly to the one that you're studying. This involves a lot of attention that we don't really give habitually, but that we need to learn to give to the segues or transitions from one scene to another. It's not coincidental, for example, that we move straight from Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom of God on the heels of John's arrest, in what we read last week from Mark, directly to his calling of his first disciples, starting in verse 16 and then following in chapter 1. That relationship between Jesus's sort of taking up the mantle of the kingdom of God that John the Baptist had been carrying after his baptism, proclaiming the kingdom of God and immediately calling disciples, that tells us something about what the kingdom is, what discipleship means, who Jesus is by the light of that sequence of scenes. So I'm going to be trying to help you lace together the scenes of Mark scene by scene, although I'll have to deal with some in more detail than others, to just give you a sense of how narrative works in the New Testament, and so how to interpret these narratives and how to perhaps perceive Jesus more clearly through that narrative presentation. And I hope, because it's part of the purpose of this class, to begin to give you some skill, some sense, perhaps even some power, I dare say, to be able to teach the narratives of the New Testament in a way that impresses upon those to whom you're speaking this person of Jesus that these narratives convey. So both of these questions are near and dear to me because I think that a lot is at stake in them. The question of Jesus as a Jew and this matter of how to read Mark, really all of the narratives of the New Testament, but especially in this case the Gospels, how to read them as narratives. It's not easy. It's not something that our use of the Gospels or Acts, for that matter, in most of our upbringing, it's not the way that we've really dealt with them, so it's a challenge. But I think that you guys are up for the task, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with you and then just wrestling with how to do this in the forums in the way that you react to what you read from me. You're going to have a similar kind of blow-by-blow presentation of the Gospel of Luke by a writer named John Howard Yoder. Won't be as focused on the sort of narrative presentation, but it will be trying to paint a picture of Jesus according to the Gospel of Luke that I hope will also address some of what I was talking about at the beginning of this video, which was how to understand Jesus as the fulfillment of the language of hope that we've been studying in the Old Testament, particularly in the prophets. So thanks again for your hard work. Look forward to the discussion this week. Hope that you find the material stimulating and inspiring.